I'm not sure when everything shifted in my family, but I can pinpoint the exact moment I truly understood how precarious my place was. It happened on an evening when my sister Felicia accused me of stealing her diamond bracelet. The accusation came out of nowhere. It was supposed to be a small family gathering in our living room. My parents sat on the couch, half watching the news, while I busied myself making iced tea in the kitchen. Felicia burst in, her voice shrill, eyes alight with anger, accusing me of having rummaged through her jewelry box. She claimed I took the bracelet to fund some personal expense, though I didn't even know she had a new bracelet in the first place. The next thing I knew, my parents were firing off questions. I tried to defend myself, but Felicia's tears convinced them of my guilt. My father looked at me with quiet contempt, and my mother refused to meet my eyes. Shock overwhelmed me as I watched every shred of trust they'd once granted me dissolve. That day, everything changed. My parents demanded I return the item, but there was nothing to return since I'd never taken anything. No matter how much I pleaded, they refused to believe me. Things escalated so quickly that I barely had time to process it all. Felicia sobbed dramatically, saying she felt violated in her own home, and my mother rushed to comfort her, glaring at me as though I'd committed an unspeakable sin. My father demanded to know what I'd done with the bracelet, how I could dare to steal from my sister, and why I would think I had any right to her belongings. My protests fell on deaf ears. Within 24 hours, they'd decided I was guilty, declared I was no longer welcome under their roof, and demanded I leave immediately. It was the first time I'd felt the crushing weight of absolute betrayal, and it burned hotter than any previous family squabble. When I tried to grab my father's arm in desperation, he pulled away so hard that I nearly fell. I will never forget the look on their faces, a mixture of disgust and disdain that cut me to the core. In my final moments in that house, I realized that I was entirely alone in my insistence on my innocence. No one believed me, and Felicia had succeeded in casting me as a villain. I walked out the door, feeling the world tilt. I was 19 years old at the time, with a promising college scholarship lined up but not fully secured. My parents had agreed to cover whatever the scholarship didn't cover, so I wouldn't have to worry about student loans. The day they kicked me out, though, my father coldly informed me he was withdrawing any financial support for my education. He said he wouldn't waste money on someone untrustworthy. I couldn't even speak as he thrust a small duffel bag into my arms, muttering that I'd better find a job because his wallet was closed. My mother echoed his decision, not so much with words, but with a frosty silence that still haunts me. I'd never seen her look at me as if I were a stranger who'd intruded on her life. Meanwhile, Felicia hovered in the background, her lips twitching in an expression I can only describe as triumph. She said nothing, but the way she smoothed her hair and avoided my gaze told me she was reveling in my downfall. I had no clue what I'd done to earn her hatred, but I left anyway, unwilling to plead for love that was no longer there. That first night away from home, I slept in my old sedan, the one thing I'd managed to purchase myself with part-time jobs during high school. I'd parked in a grocery store lot, ironically, somewhere less than a mile from my parents' house. I was cold, scared, and furious all at once. Between sleepless bouts of shivering, I kept replaying the scene in my head, Felicia pointing a trembling finger at me, tears streaming down her cheeks, acting so heartbroken that she had no choice but to call me out. It was sickening, and yet the unwavering trust my parents gave her stabbed me more deeply than her accusation. I'd always thought families sorted out their issues privately, that they'd at least hear both sides before passing a verdict. But there was no trial. Felicia was their golden child, and I was a shameful embarrassment. That's what it boiled down to, and I'd never even noticed it until it hit me full force that night. I realized I'd lost my home, my security, and maybe even my future. I spent that week driving around aimlessly when I wasn't trying to scrounge up job applications. My meager savings were just enough to keep gas in the tank and buy cheap meals from fast food joints. There were moments I nearly swallowed my pride and returned home, hoping I'd wake from this nightmare. But every time I pictured their accusing faces, I felt this sick sense of dread. They wouldn't listen to me, and there was no sense trying to beg for empathy where none existed. I decided to keep my head high as one can while living out of a car. Eventually, I landed a job as a cashier at a gas station 2 towns over. It wasn't glamorous, but it was enough to pay for a cheap motel room while I saved up for something more stable. I started to piece together a new life from the ashes of my old one, feeling both terrified and oddly liberated. For the first time, I understood I had no safety net but myself. Those early months tested me more than I'd ever been tested in my life. Every dollar I earned at the gas station went toward rent, groceries, and whatever small portion of tuition I could manage. I discovered my partial scholarship was still valid, but without parental support, I needed to pay the remainder and handle all the fees they refused to cover. I found a community college that accepted transfer credits and allowed part-time enrollment. It wasn't the dream university I'd planned for, but it offered me a chance to keep my academic goals alive. At night, I'd return to my cramped studio apartment, often too exhausted to do more than drop my bag and collapse into bed. The anger I felt toward Felicia and my parents simmered beneath the surface. There were times I'd catch myself daydreaming about confronting them, demanding they see the truth they'd ignored. Yet, each day that passed taught me how to rely on myself more than ever before. It wasn't easy, but it was shaping me into someone stronger, someone who wouldn't just cower under false accusations. 3 years slipped by in a blur of work, classes, exams, and slow progress. By the end of those 3 years, I'd saved enough money to move to a better apartment. Not luxurious, but at least it had functioning appliances and wasn't infested with roaches. I'd also completed my associate's degree in accounting. It wasn't the path I'd originally envisioned, but I discovered I had a knack for numbers and organization. During this time, I spoke to my parents only once, about a year in, when I'd been desperate enough to call them for some old documents I needed. My father answered, spoke with me for barely a minute, then curtly said he'd mail the paperwork. No inquiries about how I was doing, no questions about where I'd been living. Felicia never reached out at all, and I blocked her on every social media platform. My life slowly stitched itself together without them, and in doing so, I learned how to stand tall in my own solitude. Yet, the bitterness wouldn't fade away completely, and I doubt it ever will. During my 3rd year away from home, a curious opportunity presented itself. I was working part-time as a bookkeeper for a small auto parts supplier, and one of our regular clients mentioned they were looking for an assistant accountant at their new startup. The pay was almost double what I was currently earning, with full benefits and the potential to finish my bachelor's degree via a tuition assistance program. I jumped at the chance, interviewed, and got the job. With that boost, I was finally able to set aside some savings and enroll at a reputable online university. Around that time, I ran into an old high school friend at the supermarket who told me Felicia was engaged to a wealthy real estate developer 10 years her senior. Apparently, my parents were over the moon about it. Hearing that name again stirred something venomous inside me. I realized I'd gone 3 whole years without confronting her betrayal. I thought I'd moved on, but the anger still lingered, smoldering like coals waiting for a gust of wind to flare up again. A few weeks later, I discovered through social media that Felicia was hosting a bridal shower at an upscale restaurant in our hometown. She had posted pictures of herself holding the sparkly engagement ring, flashing the same wide-eyed grin I'd come to know as her "I'm getting exactly what I want" face. An old bitterness twisted in my gut. All I could think was, she stole my family, turned them against me, and now she's living happily ever after. It wasn't rational to blame her for everything that had happened, but I couldn't help feeling that she had orchestrated my exile. For years, I'd convinced myself I was better off without them, focusing on self-improvement and forging a new path. But seeing Felicia's gloating face brought a wave of suppressed rage I couldn't ignore. In that moment, I felt a deep, driving need to clear my name, to make her pay for her lie. I'd had enough self-righteous martyrdom, enough of trying to prove I could thrive alone. Now I wanted closure or vengeance, or maybe a bit of both. I began digging. I still had a couple of mutual acquaintances from high school who were friendly with Felicia. Carefully, I asked subtle questions: how she was doing, what she'd been up to, whether anyone had found that missing bracelet from years back. One acquaintance let slip that Felicia had experienced a rough patch a while ago, something to do with credit card debt. Apparently, Felicia had maxed out multiple cards while living a lavish lifestyle beyond her means. That made me wonder if she'd sold her own jewelry to pay off debt, then blamed me for the theft. It wasn't conclusive proof, but it raised suspicious possibilities. Another friend mentioned that Felicia had once confided a fear of being overshadowed by her sibling, how she'd do anything to ensure she stayed the family favorite. Listening to these bits of gossip made me seethe. I'd suspected jealousy, but hearing it confirmed in rumor form felt like a sick joke. My mind spun with scenarios of how I'd confront her, how I'd make her finally admit the truth. It didn't take long to realize that an outright confrontation might not achieve what I wanted. Felicia was too good at playing the victim, too adept at turning tears into a weapon. I needed something more cunning. Over the years, I'd grown more confident, more knowledgeable. I understood finances, paper trails, and the power of well-timed revelations. So, I hatched a plan. First, I reached out to the friend who mentioned Felicia's credit card struggles. With a bit of persuasion, I learned enough details to confirm that Felicia had indeed been drowning in debt around the same time the alleged bracelet theft occurred. Next, I checked public court records for any sign of lawsuits or liens filed against her in case a creditor had gone after her. Sure enough, I found a small claims suit from a credit company. It had since been resolved, but it confirmed her financial desperation at that time. It was the missing link that made everything click. She had likely sold her bracelet and pinned it on me to keep our parents' sympathy. With that knowledge in hand, I felt both vindicated and enraged, but I refused to rush in blindly. I waited until Felicia's wedding date was nearing. The rumors were swirling about this grand ceremony planned at some country club, and I knew she'd want everything to appear perfect. That was when I made my move. Using a private email account I'd created, I sent Felicia a brief, pointed message. I told her I knew the truth about the bracelet, about her debts, and how she'd set me up. I didn't threaten her directly. I just stated that I had compelling evidence pointing to her guilt and that I was done being silent. Within a day, she replied, demanding to know who I was and what I wanted. She sounded frantic, terrified that her carefully crafted public image might shatter. I let her stew for a while before responding with one simple line, "You owe me, and I will collect." Felicia didn't wait long before calling me directly. She must have guessed the sender was me, as there weren't many other people with motive to threaten her like that. When I saw her name light up my phone, my heart pounded, but I answered calmly. The first words out of her mouth were accusatory. "What the hell are you trying to do?" No apology, no remorse, just anger. I let her rant, heard her hiss about how I had no proof, how I was bitter and deranged for dragging up old drama to ruin her wedding. Then she played her usual card, crying that she'd been desperate back then. It was the closest she ever came to admitting anything. I felt a cold satisfaction uncoil in my chest. She was worried. Good. I told her I didn't care about her excuses, that I'd spent 3 years suffering for a crime she manufactured. I gave her my price. A letter addressed to our parents, detailing the truth of what happened with the bracelet, along with a hefty financial sum to compensate for my lost education funds. Her silence on the line was almost tangible. Then she spat, "You're insane," and hung up. But I knew she wouldn't risk ignoring this. Her silence was proof enough that I'd cornered her in a moment of vulnerability. I wasn't sure she'd pay, but I felt certain I'd unleashed a deep fear inside her, and that was exactly what I wanted, for her to taste the anxiety she'd forced me to live with all those nights, cold in my car alone. A week passed before I heard from Felicia again. During that time, I waited anxiously, half expecting a cease and desist letter or maybe some unwelcome encounter with my parents. But none of that materialized. Instead, Felicia emailed me with a proposition. She said she would never write a letter admitting to any theft cover-up, but she was willing to pay me a significant amount if I agreed to disappear and stop threatening her wedding. She tried to make it sound like an act of generosity, claiming she felt bad that I'd struggled for so long. The sum she offered wasn't trivial. It would cover what I'd lost in tuition plus a bit more. But it wasn't everything I'd asked for, nor did it give me the admission of guilt I craved. My first impulse was to reject her outright, but then I reconsidered. If I pushed her too far, she might double down on her lies and things could get messy. I needed to be strategic. After all, money alone wouldn't heal the wound she'd inflicted, but it might buy me the freedom to pursue my own future unencumbered. So I wrote back, proposing a meeting in person to finalize terms. I kept my tone curt and professional, letting her know I wasn't budging on wanting written acknowledgement of her role in my downfall. I needed that closure more than I cared to admit, and I was prepared to fight for it with everything I had. Her silence lasted 3 more days before she finally grudgingly agreed to meet me at a quiet cafe near her workplace downtown. Walking into that cafe felt surreal, like stepping onto a battlefield where the only weapon was truth. Felicia was already seated at a corner table, sunglasses perched atop her head, glancing around anxiously. She looked thinner than I remembered, and when our eyes met, she forced a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. I sat down across from her, calmly folding my hands in my lap. Neither of us spoke for a solid minute. Finally, she slid a sealed envelope across the table and said, "There's the check. Can we just end this?" Her voice quavered slightly, betraying her fear. I took the envelope, didn't open it yet, and quietly said, "I want it in writing." She scoffed, pulled out a single sheet of paper, and grudgingly scrawled something down. It was short, just an admission that she'd lied about me stealing her bracelet years ago, and her promise to keep her distance from my life moving forward. I read it, my heart pounding, every syllable validating the injustice I'd endured. Then I tucked it safely into my bag. I opened the envelope to glance at the check and saw she'd written a figure matching our email negotiation. It was enough to repay my lost tuition and then some. Standing, I leaned in close and whispered, "We're done here. Lose my number and don't ever try to contact me again." Before she could respond, I left, adrenaline surging through me. For the first time since that horrible day I was kicked out, I felt a sense of completeness, a finality. She owed me nothing more.